So I was going to wait just because I know everybody's rushing back from break, because this is the last panel on the last day, and certainly last but not least, I think this is one of the greatest panels and kind of brings everything together we talked about over the last couple of days. But first of all, you should all give yourself a round of applause for being here till the last day. So go ahead, give yourself a round. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the invitation, Pablo, John, to moderate this panel. It's an honor and a privilege. We are going to talk about maritime infrastructure in the Arctic. Just as I was kind of thinking about what was said over the last couple of days, on the first day, Admiral Z, Commandant of the Coast Guard, came and he mentioned that infrastructure in the Arctic really refers to infrastructure in the water. I took that to mean that that infrastructure is what you have with you or what you bring with you. And then it made me think, well, what are the different components of a maritime transportation system in the Arctic? Now, I am with the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System, or CMTS, and in 2013 and in 2015, we did infrastructure assessments for the U.S. Arctic, and certainly we think of infrastructure components as the vessels themselves, as perhaps landside infrastructure, and for the record, we in the CMTS always assume that informational infrastructure is infrastructure. And we'll certainly talk a little bit about that today. We are also, by the way, I just want to say I was incredibly pleased to learn about the NGA website with port information. We'll certainly go back and take a look at that, so thank you so much for that. Today on our panel, we have 5 presenters. They're going to do their short 5-minute overview, after which we'll take questions and answers. Our first is Ms. Ann Barker. She is the Arctic Program Leader of the National Research Council Canada. You heard her just before this panel. She'll talk about the research and development needs regarding an Arctic infrastructure. We have Ms. Kirsten Diwali. She's the Manager for Maritime Policy of Cruise Lines International Association. I think perhaps our only operator representative for the last couple of days. She will give an operator's point of view about infrastructure needs in the Arctic. Dr. Natalia Kuteva, Counselor to the Director of the Marine Rescue Service in Moscow. Ms. Denise Michaels, Director of Transportation for Kawerak, Inc., and former Mayor of Nome. And also Mr. Matt Bush, Vice President for Global Macro and Investment Research for Guggenheim Partners. So we talked a lot about infrastructure, but we're really pleased that we could also have an economist and a finance person to talk about that further. So first we'll go with Ms. Barker.
Great. Thanks, Helen. So hello again. It's time for my rant. So as part of this panel, as Helen said, I really want to focus on, because it's my background, is R&D, and what types of R&D do I feel are maybe critical for ensuring that we have robust marine infrastructure going forward. So next slide, please. So again, whirlwind tour, as Helen said, the vessels themselves, there's still work to be done. Especially with Polar Code coming in, there are lots of opportunities to make our vessels greener and more energy efficient going forward. But we also need to look at how those initiatives affect the performance of the vessels as well, and their operational needs as they go forward. Next slide, please. Okay, here's my rant. Infrastructure supporting SAR. So we focus a lot on SAR, but I'll be really blunt. People have to be alive for it to be search and rescue, and not search and recovery. And you know, these types of equipment are on many vessels, not all, but on many of the vessels that many of you are regularly on. And they meet minimum requirements under SOLAS. And those tests and evaluations are based on often benign conditions with a certain expectation of how far away search and rescue is. And you know, it really concerns me because unfortunately, and this goes for many engineering applications, it takes a tragedy to motivate R&D in these areas. So there's my rant. We'll move on. So next slide, please. There's the port and harbor infrastructure itself. And as was mentioned on day one, there's a range of infrastructure. left, sorry, is a small craft harbor under construction in Pengerton in Canada. So that's one example. The other side, we've got Nanisivik, so a deeper water port. That will be our new naval refueling station. And then the bottom slides, we have to also keep in mind that there is private infrastructure out there for mines and other operations going on. Next slide, please. We talked a lot about oil spill response. There has been a lot of work going on. Many of you are aware there's been many international initiatives going on, including an international joint industry project sponsored by OGP, looking at oil spill response. But there is still work to be done to find out where these technologies can be used, how they can be used, and how they interact with other types of technologies and recovery operations as we go forward. Next slide, please. Someone mentioned this, I think, yesterday, and I was so glad to hear it. So sewage and wastewater treatment infrastructure. Again, under Polar Code, there are new restrictions about dumping of waste in the Arctic. But even if you don't dump, and even if you're coming to port, is it reasonable to expect that our northern communities are going to be able to handle this? In Canada, Environment Canada has new discharge requirements for the nation. There is no exception to that rule. Hamlets in the north are struggling to be able to meet those requirements. And how can we expect them to be able to handle vessel waste on top of that? Next slide. Won't get into this very much, but we've talked a lot about forecasting over the course of the past couple of days. But there's also, again, getting those same tools into the hands of our local communities, because I really believe that they will find not only other uses for the tools, but they are probably going to come up with other tools that will also be extremely relevant. So coming back to traditional knowledge and making sure that's incorporated from day one when we're looking at new technology. Next slide, please. And there's so many other types of infrastructure. So again, they're all interrelated. It's not just the marine systems, IT, remote sensing, sources of energy, how to fuel resupply, the roads and changing permafrost. I've heard a lot lately in northern Canada about gravel runways, and most major airplane manufacturers are now not making landing gear that will land on these gravel runways. So are there alternate runways that we can be looking at? Of course, buildings, changing permafrost, foundation issues for the infrastructure at those ports. These are all considerations that we need to look at. Next slide, please. So key to all this is communication, I think. We need to ensure that we have a lot of discussions between stakeholders, researchers, and end users to make sure that the R&D that goes forward for infrastructure it's relevant. It needs to be used, and it's also going to be able to be resilient going forward in changing environmental conditions.
Thank you so much. Kirsten?
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Anne, for some of those topical things. I wanted to address that in my introductory comments as well. So, because this is the first you've heard from me, I wanted to take a moment to introduce Cruise Lines International Association, and then the work of my department, the Technical and Regulatory Affairs Department. So what CLIA does is we represent and advocate for our industry to external stakeholders such as yourselves. And then the work that I do comes down to advocating for legal, legislative, and technical positions of the industry in the regulatory development process. So what is our membership's interest in Arctic infrastructure? Well, infrastructure is key to what we do. It's key to our decision-making process, and whether or not we go to a destination. We don't have to go anywhere. We choose to go places based on a voyage planning and risk assessment process. So some of the special considerations associated with the Arctic, you can consider, international and local requirements. I'm sure you've heard about the Polar Code a lot in the last 3 days. That introduces a special set of requirements. We're also interested in what our passengers want. Do the passengers want to go to this region, and what experience will they have when they get there? Additionally, as Anne mentioned, there's search and rescue considerations. She showed a striking image at the beginning to say, okay, well, these parts have 14 hours worth of rescue. Other parts have 237 hours of rescue. Is that an area we want to take our passengers our passengers to? Is that going to promote safety of the ship and of the people? So integral to this is the voyage assessment. Helen mentioned earlier informational infrastructure, and that's key to the Polar Code in deciding where we need to go. I mean, Anne described Polaris. We need to know the ice information ahead of time. We need to do our evaluation to see if our ships are able to transit that area. Are they able to transit safely? We need to know temperature data. Anne had mentioned that life-saving appliances, they might work in the Caribbean for people to survive, but maybe they don't work so well in the Arctic for the time of year that we want to transit there. So that's an evaluation. There's also, marine wildlife. Where are the mammals and where are the whales going to be? We want to know that. There's, subsistence hunting that takes place in areas where we may transit. We want to know that information as well. We don't want to disrupt, people's living and lifestyles. Waste reception facilities, as Anne had mentioned, there's new requirements out there for, the discharge of oily substances, even if they've been treated through an oily water separator. So that discharge needs to go somewhere. It might not be able to stay on board for the duration of the voyage. So, that's another thing to consider. So I'll close with my introductory comments by saying, fundamental to the cruise industry's mission is the safety and security of the passengers and the ship, and we want to do that by being good environmental stewards. So I'm happy to answer any questions later on in the panel, and maybe the questions from my panelists, but I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuteva.
Thank you, Helen. I haven't any specific presentation, but I will try to submit some things concerning the main topic of this panel on Arctic infrastructure. One of the chapters of Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment deals with insufficient infrastructure in Arctic. And I would like to mention only two aspects in this regards. One of example, it's a national level, some developed of infrastructure, and another example at the international level. As national level, some of example of development of Arctic infrastructure. This is a new modern Russian port, Sabeta, which the information has been submitted by Alexei and some in my presentation. I only would like to mention in this regards that in 2006, only 19 settlers lives in Sabeta, but now about 20,000 people works in the Yamal LNG. And this port constructed in accordance with very strictly environmental standards and with international standards. This is some kind of national example. As most important, another example about our international cooperation in regards to solve the problem with insufficient infrastructure in Arctic. Many speakers mentioned Polar Code, and Kirsten also just mentioned about the very stringent regulation, namely zero discharge of oil waste from ships. I would like to recall that this is provisions is more stringent if compared with special area of MAPL. Because when neighboring countries would like to apply to IMO to designate their common water as special area, it's necessary to provide sufficient information about the adequate port reception facilities in such area. But Polar Code didn't put into force such requirement for Arctic countries. But nevertheless, this is a big problem for all shipping, because all ships should have sufficient tank for collect such information, or it's necessary to deliver it to the port. But it's a very big problem to have sufficient and adequate port reception facilities in each Arctic ports, because it's very expensive, it's so weather, it's also not air-round navigation in some ports, and more. Of course, we could deliver such service to provide such service as deliver port reception facilities to the land. But what we will do with them, with such waste, we should to organize final treatment of such waste in environmental sound way. And this is also could create some difficulties if it's small port, because we couldn't permit to organize landfill for such waste and etc. Therefore, in frame of PEMA activities, a special project has been conducted for last year, namely regional arrangements for regional port reception facilities. Under the IMO, under the MAPL Convention, there are such format, but such format now only is applied to small developing islands countries. Of course, in Arctic, all Arctic countries, we cannot name them as small or for development, but nevertheless, there are unique circumstances. And because such regional arrangements are the only practical means to satisfy the requirement to ensure for the provisions of adequate port reception facilities in this region. And under the project in question, now it prepared draft document to IMO. Now it's drafted as on behalf of all Arctic countries, and such draft document will be considered once more in the forthcoming PEMA meeting in September. But the sense of this document to elaborate regional port reception facility plan, in which will be included all information about all ports in the Arctic region and what kind of port reception facilities could be in each port, and will be designated maybe the base port along the Arctic, along the Arctic, where the ships could deliver all kind of ship-generated waste. And this is also very important that such base port should be in appropriate place, because vessels should not, it's necessary to avoid an unnecessary delay of ships, and also it's necessary to avoid change of routing of ship, especially for delivery of ship-generated waste. And therefore, it's a very important common international project, and we hope that it will be finished maybe this year, and we hope that such a common document could be submitted to the next MEPC meeting in next year.
Okay, thank you so much. Mayor Michaels.
Thank you. I have a slide.
We have a presentation.
My name is Denise Michaels. I am the Transportation Director for Kawerak and Nome in the Bering Straits region. If you can go to the second slide, please. Our region is about the size of Virginia when you include the water, and the Diomede Islands and Wales are right in the Bering Straits, where we see all of the ships pass at the same time, where marine mammals and birds are also going through along with our hunters and fishers. And I want to thank Marie and the city manager. They did a lot of the work that I don't need to explain. Great presentations. We are a tribal consortium. We have self-compacted since '92. And we have Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island, Yupik, and Central Yupik along in our region. Next, please. This is our vision, our mission. You can go to our website, kawerak.org, to look at the rest of these and our departments. But just like the other regions in Alaska, our culture, language, food security, infrastructure, water, sewer, housing are basic needs in the Arctic. Next, please. These are some of the items that we've been working on regarding helping develop or shape Arctic policy. The Bering Straits PARS, the Arctic Waterway Safety Committee, Kawerak is a member of ICC Alaska. We have Marine Mammal Coalition co-management group that are very successful. We've participated in Arctic policy, U.S. policy, and international policy. There's just a little blurb there that the quote from the polar regions regarding climate change. The most important thing we want folks to remember is societal benefit gains for the people of our region, along with the people, the other Inuit. Make sure that it's positive for health and human wellness, food security, environmental, social, and economic development and opportunities. Next, please. With the opening of the Arctic, less ice, we have seen a plethora of stuff happening, kite borders, everything you can think of. People trying to walk across in the winter in the Bering Straits. We have a gold rush happening in Nome again. Things are washing up on shore that we have no idea where they're from. That's on St. Lawrence Island. And the question was, well, who owns it? Because the island is owned by Sewage. Was it the person that found it? Do we have to give it back to whomever it was? It was just, it creates, the debris coming around is interesting. And of course at the Port of Nome, we've always had cruise ships, and now the bigger cruise ships are coming. The World stops there along with Crystal Serenity, along with other ships. Most important, at the same time that's happening, against our subsistence hunters are out there. Next, please. Oh, one more back. The commissioner mentioned we have seen a huge increase in the Port of Nome. We just recently put a third area in there so that more vessels can park, and so you can see the numbers. And then the Marine Exchange provides great numbers for us to report on when we're doing our presentations. Thank you. Next. The PAIM created a document that asks the states to work on creating best practices for tourism. And so as a member of the Arctic Waterway Safety Committee, we took this task, and the chair, Willie Goodwin, had Paul Foos and I co-chair to create an Arctic coastal marine document, which we submitted to Amati, which I just was happy to learn about the NAG. And it's got the same information out there that folks can tie into, so at some point it would be good if those two start talking. The Arctic Waterway Safety Committee also has their draft waterway safety plan out for public comment, and you can go to the website for that. So we are doing some of the work at the international level, at the state level, getting that information out there. Next, please. Most importantly, the U.S. Coast Guard, again, the PARS, we've been working, having public meetings, putting that information out to our tribes and our villages and our cities. The Marine Safety Information Bulletin, the voyage planning basically follows the same line as the PARS. And then most importantly, we really support geofencing on AIS and not MPAs, because marine mammals have no boundaries. They might be there next year. The year after, we don't know where they're going to be, so that's important for us. Next, please. Again, the state of Alaska's environmental conservation has a spill prevention website. In here, you can go and look at data that's almost same like the Amati and the NAG, where it identifies places for refuge that's been identified by industry. The communities have identified areas of concern where there's high ecological marine mammals, fish, birds, underwater plants that we eat. So there's the website for you to look at that as a resource. Next, please. So I'm going to go from the region down. This is from Bering Straits Native Corporation. We are very mineral rich but infrastructure poor in the region. Port Clarence is working on developing Point Spencer, and it is already a natural port of refuge. It's been used since the whaling days, and so it's there. We have on the bottom there, you can see Graphite One Resources is looking at developing the area. It will need to be able to have to ship it out. The Lost River on the other end is another mine. So there's other mines and lands located there that could be developed once the deep draft port's developed. Next, please. Of course, the Port of Nome is the only port north of Nunivak Island. It's a medium draft port. We're at -22. Our goal is to get to -40. We are so swamped in the fall time when we have storms and in the summer. With the dredges there, they're getting bigger and they're needing more space inside the inner harbor, and so we have plans to develop a floating dock for them so that they can get out of the storms during harm's way. And then we'd like to make it an L shape so that it can protect the larger vessels with the drafts up to minus 35 into the inner harbor, outer harbor. Thank you. Next. This is just an example of what our contractors have to do to unload our construction material, because none of our villages have the important harbor infrastructure. You have to use onshore equipment, making sure they don't get stuck, build a road to get to your landing craft, and then start unloading. Next. Little Diomede. That we're working with the Corps of Engineers for a subsistence harbor right now. It was authorized, but it hasn't been appropriated. This is an example of one of the cruise ships and their passengers getting off because it's big boulder rock. They don't have a beach there, and that's called adventure tourism right there. Next, please. Gambell, again, is another place. It's deep in front of it, but no infrastructure there, so we're always having to build a road to be able to unload our equipment off there. So it's an extra cost in the construction project that folks need to be aware of. Next, please. Someone showed this is a typical type of fuel operations. The fuel barge sits offshore, and a hose is brought over and connected. This is a fuel header in Breivik mission. So this is just the type of operations that happen, and you have to wait out the weather, costing more money for the firms that are working out there because we have the lack of port and harbor infrastructure out there. Next, please. This is St. Michael, Alaska. It's another natural area for protection when ships are floating out there. And again, no port infrastructure, so you have to build it. Next, please. This is Untitled. It's shallow in front, and you really have to have a really good pilot to have to know where you need to land. Again, the same thing. You need to build the infrastructure out there. This cat is holding a line there, keeping the barge close by, so that when they're ready after they build the road, it can be pulled in. Next, please. And the tug's waiting way out there. Climate change. This is courtesy of Bowhead. This is Point Lonely in 2009, where they used to use it to unload their barges. And after severe coastal erosion, 2014, you can't use it anymore. So you have to be very careful, have that local knowledge. Our folks that have been working up there for years and years really know the area real well. So just kind of point out what was there is no longer there with whatever type of infrastructure we're using. Next, please. This person had to wait a year because the river got too low in White Mountain, and so they weren't able to get their house that year. This is just another example of lack of infrastructure and what we have to do. Next, please. Anyway, we're really excited when you heard Elizabeth about Quintillion's fiber optic. That's going to be a game changer for everyone at those hub communities. As someone had asked the other day, Congress passed the NDAA requesting that the military, I think it's Northcom, work with ELCOM to figure out an Arctic port for national security. And we are so excited about that, and we welcome them to come and do boots on the ground to do an assessment. Graphite One, again, I mentioned, you can look at their website. They're in their second phase, and by 2020, they'll let us know if it's a go. It's one of the largest graphite mines in the U.S. with large flake, and it'll be really important for all of our electronics that we work with. Again, we're looking forward with the IMO, with the U.S. Coast Guard to work on the Bering Straits PARs with our Russian counterpart. And that's it.
Thank you so much. And Matt Bush.
Thanks.
Guggenheim.
Yeah, so Guggenheim is an asset management firm. We manage money for insurance companies, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds, who generally all have a very long-term investment time horizon. So as we look around the world and look for long-term investment opportunities, we're increasingly focusing on infrastructure as a very interesting investment for us from a long-term perspective, and that's for a couple of reasons. Number one is that just by its very nature itself, it's a physical asset that has a long life, and it tends to produce more stable, predictable returns that for investors who need a 20, 30-year time horizon, that's very attractive to have that predictability. And infrastructure also tends to be an asset that generates cash flows and performs well regardless of what's going on in other financial markets and really in the broader economy. So from a diversification standpoint, again, that's a positive. And then I'd say the third reason that we're focusing on infrastructure more and more is recognizing its role in economic development. So when we look at fast-growing regions around the world, we know that infrastructure will be an important part of that growth. And rather than try to pick a specific company or a specific industry we think will do well, by investing directly in infrastructure, we get to be a part of that economic growth without trying to pick any winners. So as for why we're focused on Arctic infrastructure specifically, over the past several years we've gotten to know the Arctic more and more as we've had both clients and a few small investments in the region. And spending time in the region, traveling to the region, we've seen that taking a very long-term view, there is a lot of economic opportunity up there. But we've also seen that given the deficient infrastructure in the region, that economic opportunity will never be realized unless more investment is brought into the region to fill that infrastructure gap. And so given the lack of large institutional investors who are active in the Arctic, who are really even paying attention to the Arctic, to be frank, we think we can play a pretty unique role in facilitating more investment into the region. And so we've kind of taken a couple different paths to do that. The starting point was trying to come up with a set of standards or guidelines that we wanted ourselves and also other investors to operate by when making investments in the Arctic. So we were part of the development of the Arctic Investment Protocol a few years ago, which is basically a code of conduct for how responsible and sustainable investment should be made in the region. So it's available publicly, but it's things like protecting the environment, working with local communities, integrating science or traditional knowledge, and prioritizing local economic growth over short-term financial returns. And this kind of gave us a philosophical base to start operating by. And the next step from that has been working with the World Wildlife Fund and other environmental and social organizations to come up with a set of decision-making tools to let us and other investors evaluate infrastructure projects for their sustainability. And so the goal of these tools is to go beyond just a sort of checklist approach to evaluating projects. It aims to be more scientific, more quantitative, and have actual measurable metrics we can use, which sounds like it'd be more time-consuming, but once the tools are in place, it'll give us a more straightforward and give us more certainty about evaluating projects. And once these tools are developed, the next step is to actually set up a new private financing institution specifically focused on making investments into Arctic infrastructure. And talking to other investors, talking to our clients, there's a lot of interest in this. If you talk to these investors, pretty unanimously, you hear that they're looking for more infrastructure investment. They just can't find the projects to invest in. And so by taking that high demand we have for infrastructure projects and kind of marrying that with the huge need we see in the Arctic region, we think we can do something pretty unique and do it in a sustainable way based on the principles and the tools that we're developing.
Thank you so much. So I'd like you to, those of us in the room and online, think about your questions. And while you do that, I'd like to kick it off if I could. Matt, you said something interesting that followed on the mayor said, that they need to build infrastructure in order to get infrastructure to a port. You said you need infrastructure to invest in infrastructure. So we talk a lot about public-private partnerships, both in the federal government and throughout industry when it comes to investments and how we invest. I'd like to follow up a little bit. I challenge you just a little bit on the tool that you're thinking of using to make infrastructure investment. The CMTS did a report in 2016 on the use of public-private partnerships in the U.S. Arctic. One of the observations we received from talking to folks was that P3s are good, but you need the cash flow. It's not about free money, it's a financing tool, and to do that you need a cash flow. So where do you see that cash flow coming in your infrastructure investments, whether it's a P3 or otherwise?
Well, I think that's a problem with all P3s, but I think specifically to the Arctic, one of the issues is the small scale of these projects. They may not seem small to an individual town, but speaking as someone who works for a fairly large asset manager, it's not worth the investment in time and due diligence and getting familiar with the region for a fairly small scale project that's just a one-off project. So I think one approach to P3s is basically bundling projects, and rather than ask a private investor to participate in one small roadway, maybe it's 5 or 6 roadways in the region, or maybe it's a roadway that connects to the port, that connects to port facilities, and it's all bundled up, and that makes it more scalable for an investor like us and justifies the amount of resources we would need just to go in and evaluate that investment.
Would that put more responsibility on the local communities to be more creative? Who in the end becomes the responsible folks that look to that bundle, and to whom do they talk?
Yeah, I think initially it does fall to not only local communities, but state governments and federal governments as well. And it relates to the problem of, if you talk to investors, one of the issues you always hear them say is that there's not enough of a pipeline of projects. And what they mean by that is they just don't know what projects are out there. It's not as easy as you might think to find some of these projects to invest in. So I think kind of publicizing those projects more, doing a little bit more marketing, and it's a problem on both sides. Investors, I think, need to do a little bit more on-the-ground research to find those projects. But if those were more widely known, then I think you would have the investor side also saying, well, hey, what if, I'm aware of these 4 projects, what if we kind of come up with some structure where we can bundle these all together?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to waste reception facilities. Earlier today, a colleague that was attending said that the need for reception facilities is probably one of the most important infrastructure needs, certainly for the U.S. Arctic. But I'd be interested to know, for Kirsten, representing the cruise line industry, to what extent do they really need reception facilities in order to operate in the Arctic, U.S. or otherwise?
I think that's a great question, Helen. So to what extent do the cruise lines need waste reception facilities? Well, to a great extent, actually. And part of our, so I had mentioned earlier, we need them in the Arctic, at least for oily substances. We can't discharge even, oil that had gone through or oily water that had even gone through the oily water separator. But also, CLIA members have agreed to not discharge any untreated sewage overboard. So, there's parts that, after it goes through the advanced wastewater treatment system, that are suitable for discharge, and then there's parts that aren't. So we need a waste reception facility to land that. So as well as garbage and other wastes, recyclables and the items that you can't discharge overboard. It needs to land somewhere. And I think that goes back to what one of my colleagues up here was saying before, is there's the waste reception, so once it gets off the ship, but then do the towns or do the countries have the means to treat that after it's landed in an environmentally friendly way?
The MARPOL certified reception facility is very different than other reception facilities, and taking on international waste is very specific, with very specific, especially in the United States, USDA rules and certifications. So it isn't simple. And so, Mayor, in Nome, given your interest to build the port, and well, it's being thrust upon you, the business that you're getting, what kind of challenges do you find with trying to address the reception facility requirement?
I was just appointed to the Port Commission, and we are looking right now at that project in Nome right now with our engineers, and it's just in the planning phase, realizing it is a very huge need, especially with the cruise ships that come into the Port of Nome. So we are looking at that.
Dr. Kateva, and with regard to reception facilities, are there any challenges specific to the climate with regard to reception facilities, or are they subject to the same wear and tear and challenges of connections as any other kind of asset, physical asset?
Yes, of course, because so climate, low temperature, and in many ports not round-year navigational. Only some ports, for instance, in Russia, open only in summer navigation. Therefore, it's very expensive and not economy efficiency to build such port reception facilities, especially if we are speaking about final treatment of such. Because I know that you understand that build biological treatment of sewage, which could deliver from large cruise vessels, it's rather expensive and rather great land facilities. Therefore, it's rather difficult, and it's problem for all Arctic nations, because of course if it's a big port, for instance as Sabeta, it could be, but if it's not so big port, it's rather difficult. I only would like to mention when I spoke about this project that co-chair of this project US Coast Guard and Russian Federation, and of course all other Arctic nations participate in this.
Thank you so much. So are there any questions from the audience? We have a question up there. Why don't you read them? I can't.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. This is a question, I think, for Denise, but also for Matt. Looking at the community needs, if there is increased traffic in the region, it's not just needing to service the vessel, but also if people are coming aboard, what is the need for hospitals, for hotels, for that kind of infrastructure? And then, Matt, is there a connection between, and I'm not sure if I'm going to use the term correctly, but it's like investment recycling. So you can invest in sort of power infrastructure or hotel infrastructure, and then the revenue from that is then partnered to invest in other infrastructure that might have a different type of return on investment that would be less profitable or attractive to an investor.
Do you want me to start?
Please.
So we're lucky we're an established town, so we have a brand new hospital constructed, we have hotels, car rentals, we have a road system that's unique compared to other hub communities. We have over 200 miles of roads. So the infrastructure is there to support the cruise ship industry, the mining industry, visitors, so it's pretty successful.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I would just say on the issue of financing social infrastructure is what we call it, and potentially with a lower rate of return. I think one thing to keep in mind is the private investor community isn't monolithic. There's all kinds of investors with different kinds of risk and return requirements, including philanthropic groups, endowments, foundation, who generally do have a lower required rate of return. So that's something that could be interesting to them. And there's also ways you can structure any investment where a group like that is taking the lower rate while still having participation from some larger investment companies out there who have higher rates of return.
Thank you. Could we take, John's kind enough to monitor the online questions. Do we have one?
Sure, we have quite a few actually. First one is, the global economy has been expanding for 8 years. Can you quantify how sensitive the cruise industry is to the economy and the Arctic cruise segment in particular?
I think that's to you, Kirsten.
That, unfortunately, I'm not, off the top of my head, I really can't provide an answer to that question, but I'm happy to be followed up with if there's a way to get that, the questioner my contact information.
Maybe to rephrase it just slightly.
Sure.
So Kirsten, I assume the cruise market continues to grow?
Mm-hmm.
And where does the Arctic or polar region piece of that sit, and how do your folks look at it?
Sure, I appreciate the rephrase. So, as many of you heard me speak about just briefly earlier, as well as throughout the last couple of days about the Polar Code, there are a lot of considerations that both big cruise lines and small expedition-style cruise ships need to consider when sailing in these regions. With the Polar Code entering into force, as well as other international and local requirements, it's not very simple for a cruise ship to elect to go to the Arctic region. So perhaps as the ice continues to melt and it gets warmer, there may be an increase in that region, but in the near term, you're likely to see the increases elsewhere in the world.
Is there a drastic increase in insurance related to going into those regions?
I know that insurance companies are beginning to look at this, especially with the Polar Code entering into force, but I do not know the answer to that question.
Thank you. There was a question over here. Catherine?
Yeah.
Yep,
want me to
wait for a
ask
mic.
one
We'll
more
go
of these
to,
while we
that
run
sounds
on?
great. Thank you.
This might be best for Denise, but there's a question. Who's going to be the quote-unquote deep pocket investor in a Nome port expansion or any similar harbor, such as at Port Blossom, and how will they make their money back as well as a return on their investment?
I think Matt said philanthropists. So I guess that'd be you and me, John, I guess.
So right now the project is going through the Corps of Engineers, and as the non-federal sharer, the city has to provide the match depending on the size and the depth of the project. We also have to look at our own revenue, bonds. There's different ways to finance public-private partnership. As a local sponsor, we have about $100 million that we would need to invest our own for the road, the lights, and stuff like that.
Just if I could ask real quickly, now, not too long ago, a year or so ago, Nome expanded, added a new dock system, right? How was that paid for specifically?
Oh, it's huge for our operators. It's less time waiting out there doing donuts, trying to come into the port. It's more efficient for them, and we've also added a second ramp so we can have two barges, landing craft operating at the same. It's created a lot of efficiency for the industry.
But how was it paid for?
We had a GO bond, and we also used our own tax funds revenue.
Thank you. Yes, Kirsten.
Just to follow up with what Denise and Helen were talking about earlier, having a place to moor, a pier to come up to, is another infrastructure need that the cruise industry would be looking at. It ensures better safety of our passengers to land at a pier as opposed to tendering in and out of port.
So I guess Crystal Serenity, if the weather had been bad, they wouldn't have been lightering people into Nome, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we had I'm sorry, but Catherine was first with the microphone, and then yeah, so does Catherine,
Surprise,
and then we'll go to Martin. Has it after that?
Thanks, Helen. I have a question for Matt. You said that Guggenheim is interested in bundling projects in the Arctic. What's the status? How do people who have ideas for bundling access folks who might be interested in financing?
Yeah, so in terms of the Arctic specifically, it's just an idea. It's not something that we're actively looking at. When we're looking at projects in the Arctic, generally they are of a sufficient scale that it doesn't require bundling. But for probably the majority of needed infrastructure projects, they are too small, at least for us. So it's a concept right now. It's not something that's actively being done.
I've got a quick follow-up. Can you give some numbers as to what constitutes small versus large? I mean, who knows? Maybe there is a bundling that somebody can come up with.
I mean, it does really vary, but anything under $30 million is generally too small for an institutional investor.
Thank you. Dr. Jeffries?
Thanks, Helen. My question is not directed at anyone in particular, and it's possible perhaps someone in the audience has an answer rather than a panelist. But on Tuesday, I think it was, Anthony Edwardson of the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, he described...
Mic on.
Is this on?
It is, okay.
You see John shaking his head, wondering what's
He's at
going on.
UIC, he's not at ASRC.
UIC, okay. But anyway, he described the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, one of a number of Alaska Native corporations, as I think a $1 billion corporation. So I wonder, what do we know about the Alaska Native corporations and the degree to which they're investing at home rather than in the lower 48 and overseas? What's their role in some of these infrastructure projects?
Michael, sorry. Sorry, Denise can take that, please.
Yes, Bering Straits Native Corporation is our regional corporation located in Nome, and they are looking at developing Port Clarence as a deep draft port also. So they are very engaged in Arctic development.
Thank you. Did anybody want to else answer that from the audience? Yes, please. Can we get her microphone? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Leanna Mack, and I'm the Deputy Advisor to the North Slope Borough Mayor. And unfortunately, he's at the Arctic Eskimo Whaling Commission convention right now. But UIC and ASRC are both investing heavily in our region. And UIC has a concept for a port that they've had cleared with our shareholders. And the North Slope Borough does have projects that could be bundled that could be potentially over $30 million. And so ASRC and UIC are both very active in the lower 48 as far as contracts, but what they do at home is a lot more for our communities and shareholders.
Thank you. Thank you. Could we take a question online?
Yes. Another one about the cruise industry. It says, will the cruise industry invest in Arctic infrastructure, for example, aids to navigation? Given the rapid growth of tourists going to this region, don't they have some obligation to do so?
Thank you for the question. So, with respect to investing in infrastructure and informational infrastructure, that would go back to the voyage planning of the ship and of the company. In that, if it's an area that the company plans to go to more often, they may make investments, including in port infrastructure. I mean, it's not unheard of. It's been done in other regions of the world in which the cruise industry frequents more often. But that would be a case-by-case basis. Again, you know, when you make these voyage assessments and you're looking at an area you want to go to, and if the desire is great enough to get to that area, you need to find a way to make it safe, and perhaps that is improvements to aids to navigation or working with the local governments and charting authorities. You know, a program like CASRAS can go a long way to helping us determine whether or not an area is a go or no-go area based on the information and navigational aids. And that's not just ice data, it's not just temperature data, but that's also hydrographical data as well.
Called virtual aids to navigation.
Virtual aids to navigation.
So if someone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. We're going to get the microphone to you. And while we're doing that, I have a question for Matt. So yesterday, Matt, the last panel talked, there was a group talking about creating an Arctic seaway, whereby an international maritime coalition would establish a maritime operational schema that might include a development bank to address infrastructure needs. Is an infrastructure bank an easy thing to do? And how do investors and finance people look at infrastructure banks?
So the first part, I think, no, it's a very difficult thing to do. I think a lot of countries have tried to set them up, and many have failed ultimately, although there are a few good examples. Colombia, Mexico, India, I think have all done pretty well with infrastructure banks. From the private investment side, it's definitely something that we would welcome. I mentioned earlier, you know, the different risk and return profiles of different investors. and an infrastructure bank or a development bank definitely fits in a different category than someone like us. So they're able to take different positions within the structure of an investment. They're able to take on more risk while accepting lower return. They're able to fund the initial project preparation, which is very important in getting projects ready for more established, larger investors. Oftentimes when a project's still in its early planning stages, that's too early for a large investor to get involved in. And so an infrastructure bank can help accelerate that phase and be part of helping the preparation phase. And then the last thing I think they can bring to the table is developing that project pipeline as well, helping identify what opportunities are out there, and hopefully they'll have a good relationship with private investors, and they'll be able to go to these investors with a list of projects and say, these are what we have, what looks interesting to you, rather than the investor having to go and do the work themselves to find all these projects that might be dispersed, all over the Arctic.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the audience? You have the microphone?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. There are many nations involved here, the military, tourism, solo adventurers, resource extraction, many different players represented by the panel here and such. And this is just a question about an infrastructure, I guess, of coordination between these various groups. Let's say there is a functionally ice-free North Pole in the summertime and everyone's up there. Has it already been established an agreement about what time is it at the North Pole? Or what does an east wind of 20 knots mean at the North Pole? I've spoken to some folks that are at South Pole Station in Antarctica. Apparently, they run on Christchurch, New Zealand time by agreement from all players. And they have some kind of a Cartesian grid that they put over the pole so that everyone knows that, well, today we've got a wind out of 9 or 0 degrees at 10 knots or something. And everyone knows what that means. Has this been established for the North Pole yet?
Great point. Anybody care to take that? No? Canada? Russia? United States?
It's a good question, though.
I'm
curious.
Do you want to talk about that?
No, I said now I'm curious.
It's a really great point. Just as a sidebar, I was thinking when we learned yesterday that in Russia they had a strategic plan as it relates to their rivers, their roads, their runways, kind of a thing. And I'm presuming that meant you had one ministry in Russia from which you could develop a strategy where those specialties were all under one ministry. Is that perhaps the case?
It will be depends on the project.
Okay.
As concern great infrastructural project in shipping, this is Ministry of Transport. And I would like to recall again to our example of public-private partnerships. This is Port of Sabete, because the investigation and investment to this project was on behalf of state budgetary as well as non-budgetary fund. At the expense of budgetary fund are formed sea channel, water area of port and approach channel, ice barrier, offshore facilities, and vessel traffic system. And at the expenses of non-budgetary funds are formed technological moorings, berths for LNG and gas condensate, piers, coastal building, and infrastructure. Therefore, it's real project of such investment from the state and non-budgetary funds. Some kind of example. Of course, it's not deals with tourism. This is this LNG very economical benefit project.
So, we learned this morning from Ambassador Bolton that there are a number of forums to have those kind of conversations. I guess if you look at it from an maritime operational point, the Coast Guard Forum could handle it. Maybe it is something for the Arctic Council. But I think it's a really great point that hasn't really been talked about yet, and perhaps it'll be an evolution. If I could just ask just a real quick question from each of you before we close. What 1 or 2 infrastructure priorities relative to your parochial interest do you think are of greatest interest? Anne?
I guess for me, it's a lot about the sewage and wastewater, those types of infrastructure. Again, it's really hard to prioritize, but I see that being, certainly in Canada, one area that has a direct impact on many of our communities who are struggling with it themselves. And so I think it's an area of concern. But again, my rant, come back to the life-saving appliances. It worries me. You know, never mind cruise industry going up there, our Navy, our Coast Guard operations, our resupply for our northern communities. They're there regularly, and they're there all the time. And it's a concern about safety.
Thank you so much. Kirsten?
That's an excellent question. I would say for our industry, it would have to be the informational infrastructure associated with having the historical knowledge of you know, the ice charts, the temperatures, what to expect when you're up there, hydrographical charting, and so on. And this is all key to us establishing with a great deal of confidence whether or not this is a safe operation for us to conduct. So that would definitely be our #1 priority.
Thank you. Dr. Kuteva?
Yes, thank you. According to the scope of my responsibility, of course, it's port reception facility for ship-generated waste in one side. And another, this is enlarge of oil spill preparedness and response. Because in my presentation, I mentioned that we have some preposition of oil spill preparedness equipment in the Arctic zone, but of course, take into account the potential risk. It should be enlarge such preposition of oil spill response equipment, as well as maybe more multi-purpose vessels in this region also. Standby.
That's a great, thank you so much. Mayor?
Most of our tribes have long-range transportation plans and economic development plans. You saw Commissioner Hladek's presentation. I think if you look at statewide, LNG pipeline would be great for the whole state because we need more revenue into our coffers. Then you go down to the region. Even though we live in a developed country, some of our villages have third world conditions: basic housing, water, sewer, cheaper power. All of our regional hubs, we need port infrastructure, totally support that. So any development to improve the quality of life for us up in the Arctic would be beneficial.
Thank you. Matt, you mentioned that infrastructure is one of your priority interests. Is there anything to elaborate or you'd like to share?
No, I'd just say one thing that I think is a priority to bring in more outside investment is, on the one hand, more creative ways of financing, and that falls on both sides, the investor and the investee. And number two, better project preparation, meaning more fully baked plans that are presented to investors. And part of that falls on the public side, I think, in funding that preparation.
Did you say the public side?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that idea. Appreciate it. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, everybody, today. Really appreciate it. Pablo, I hope that we can talk about infrastructure again in the future. And thank you to everybody who participated with us.
Thank you, Helena, and thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm not sure if I have enough of these glass wipes, but you're interested, let me know. Okay, so here we are, finally hit the last step, and I'd like to thank you all. Particularly, I'd like to thank all standalone speakers, panelists, and panel leads, particularly, specifically Lawson Brigham and Helen Bro. I'd like to thank the audience, both in person and through the webcasts, for participating. Fran Ulmer, the chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and John Farrell, in particular, the executive director and his staff, including Kathy Farrell and others. Commander Ruth Lane, thank you for your support. She's the director of the National Ice Center, and also would like to thank your staff for helping us. I'd like to thank NOAA and ESDIS for providing web services, including the support of Lori Brown and also coordination by Aisha Hinton. I'd like to thank the Alaska State Society for that very nice reception on Tuesday. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the Naval Heritage Center for great service and support that they provided throughout the conference. I'd like to inform you that the 7th IDA website will be updated to include all presentations, posters, videos, and a final report, hopefully soon. John? I'd like to thank John Falkingham for being our note-taker for the meeting. I'm glad I looked your way. And finally, thank you all. Have a good trip back home, and I'll see you in 2019.